It's really confusing to have the cat also be named Spider-Man, so I'll call him Tobeans Maguire for clarity. After 2 long years of waiting since Insomniac's initial groundbreaking superhero caper, Spider-Man Miles Morales has released and is exactly what we were all hoping for. A shorter, but still pretty good salad game where he plays a younger and more inexperienced version of the series' usual hero, and save the city during Christmas by punching people with lightning. So Arkham Origins. It looks smoother, plays more fluidly, feels more fine-tuned, and from a technical perspective is an absolute marvel. Spider-Man. From a gameplay standpoint, Miles is an upgrade in just about every way. From improved animations and combat to small things like cutting out some of the less interesting sections of the original game, like the circuit puzzles and the human stealth. Now I don't have to play as that lame punk-ass human Miles. I'm big, strong Super Miles with the fresh-ass fade and the Tims.
Where to my Tims?
Somebody please teach Peter how to dress. He looks like a school teacher. Oh wait, yeah. So let's talk about what's been improved, since there's not a lot of new things here from the main game. If you want my thoughts on all the basic stuff, be sure to check out my review of the original Insomniac's Disney's Marvel's Spider-Man Peter Parker PS4. Well, we got some vast improvements on stealth, which makes sense because Miles can turn
invisible! Did you check that shit?
It's a really huge step up that you can web people up from the walls and ceilings again. Now we're back to the level of stealth we had in 2010.
The Bone Collector returns. With the ability to grow my nest even larger to feed the Charlie Horde, I can ensnare corpses at 360 degrees around any environment. For all the world is my nest.
That's not going to be funny at all for people who are watching my videos for the first time, and the people who do get the joke will get a light chuckle out of it at best. So yeah, the new invisibility mechanic is a lot of fun and gives you way more options for stealth. But that's the trade-off with having far less gadgets than Peter. Peter's stealth was about impact webbing everyone to a wall as fast as you could in like 4 seconds, while this one forces you to take your time and plan your moves a little better. It's not as chaotic, and it's a little more engaging to have to work with less.
I'm Spider-Man.
The addition of Miles' electric powers is pretty cool, if a little over the top. In the comics, it never seemed like he was able to just shoot lightning out of his hands or absorb batteries. In this game, he's just going full-on static mode. Cole McGrath once again remains the only white guy with electric powers. These new powers give Miles some interesting new gameplay mechanics, like using the Venom Punch to take down big groups of enemies or heavily shielded ones, or powering batteries and tethering machinery together in puzzles. Some of this stuff was really fun and a nice change of pace from the usual Spider-Man game combat and puzzles. I prefer this a lot to the previous game's hacking minigames. It's a shame Peter won't be able to do this stuff in the mainline sequel because it was neat. Though maybe we'll get to switch back and forth between both Spider-Men in that one. However, as much as I love the gameplay, I felt like the boss fights were a bit lacking both in number and execution. They didn't want to give Miles too much, so he's just dealing with small fries that Peter would wash in 3 seconds, or hand-me-downs. Or holograms of hand-me-downs. Might as well make the kid fight Tupac. Though it's a nice idea to have Rhino be a recurring villain for Miles considering the near impalement that happened in the original game. We get the usual Rhino fare of tricking him into ramming into something that'll hurt him. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. That's a winning formula going 2 decades strong now. Now we'll mention that the chase sequences, all 2 of them, are pretty amazing. But the actual brawling with supervillains feels a little undercooked. Tinkerer and Prowler don't feel that much different from normal enemy types. They just do more damage and have more variations of moves. I feel like this series could take a page out of God of War's book and try to mix the boss fights with the elaborate action set pieces a bit more. There's this disconnect where the Uncharted-style destruction porn happens during these chase sequences or a QTE, but the actual fight scene just happens in a boring, walled-off arena. I want Spidey fighting people on the side of a collapsing building, or upside down underneath a bridge, or on the back of a moving train. In that regard, the main game was slightly better about boss fights feeling more intense and explosive. I'm hoping the third game really nails that aspect with more boss variety, more memorable and unique encounters, and more superhero spectacle mixed in. This is scientifically inaccurate. The city activities are probably the best they've been in any Spider-Man game, with a new layer of depth that they haven't really had before. Every little side quest or good deed has a bit of a story structure to it, which connects all of them together into an interesting side narrative that feels like a really solid back issue of a Miles comic. Every side objective feels like it has a tangible effect on the city and how New Yorkers view Miles as a hero. Hearing the positive and negative press generated by your spectacular daily routine from J. Jonah Jameson and Danica Hart can give you a good sense that what you're doing really matters to the people of New York. And that ties into the main theme of the whole story. The side missions finally matter for more than just grinding points for upgrades and costumes. And the upgrades and costumes are great too! Miles, please son, stop with the identifying markers! Now Spider-Man's got the same shoes as Miles Morales, and is wearing his backpack and jacket from school. It's too conspicuous. Why do so many of these have hoods that would never stay up while swinging? Everyone has hoods lately. Hoods are to this decade as robot arms are to the 90s. Hoods, hoods, hoods. Ben Reilly had a hood once. You know what happened to him? Venom strangled him with it in like his first day wearing that costume, and then he got rid of it like a smart person. Might as well throw a cape on here. Once again, I am always for having Spider-Men build their own costumes by hand as a rite of passage. But I wish they acknowledged this to some extent. But anyway, I love a lot of these costumes, and I'm happy to see that all the ones from the comics I was hoping would make it into the game did. Insomniac does a great job of making any Spidey suit look realistic and functional, while also still being instantly recognizable as a pull from the source material. Just a little bit of seam work and panel lining on it, and any suit can look badass in photorealism. I just think it's missing that one suit from Life Story where Otto Octavius brain-swapped Miles to steal his exaggerated swagger. An imposter has stolen Miles' face! Hey, wait a minute, that wasn't there before. What the hell? Now everyone's acting like that was always there. Man, this really is based on a comic book. Ugh, I'm gonna have to talk about this, huh? I know. Before you ask, I know. Okay, Okay. You know what? To explain my feelings about it, I'll just show you what I tweeted when I first saw it. Quote, "The reason I'm so averse to it is because I got emotionally attached to this version of Peter Parker. That includes his voice and his face. Changing him so drastically makes me feel disconnected from him. It's weird and uncanny now. It's like if a close friend came over one day looking like a completely different person. It would be so jarring and disturbing hearing a familiar voice coming out of a stranger's mouth. To a degree, I still think this, and if I really had the power to change it back, I would. But more so just to preserve the continuity because my OCD flares up when I play these games back to back now and see something different. But in all fairness, that's what happened when they put webs on the PS1 costume in the flashback cutscenes in the sequel. That's not how it looked before! Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. It's still got Yuri's awesome voice, and there are more important things in the world to lose sleep over or start petitions for. Although, if I were to put on my tinfoil hat for a second, I don't know if I necessarily buy the official explanation put forth by the developers. They say they needed someone whose face shape could match Yuri's motion capture data more closely as they move on to a new console generation where the technology has leaped again. Understandable, but what about these other characters? Not everyone looks exactly like their motion actors, but they kept their faces. Andy Serkis doesn't look like a chimpanzee, but they make that work. And if you wanted it to really match Yuri's topology, why not just make a more youthful version of his own face? We can do that now too! It may be just another case of wanting your brands to match across various mediums, because, yeah, if you squint your eyes a little and look at him from, like, the right angle, he looks like Tom Holland. But you could say that about the old face in Andrew Garfield. A really substantial portion of stuff from the game was made to match or at least somewhat evoke the aesthetic and world building of those movies, because they were more current when the game first went into development. Now it's like 6 years later and Tom is the new thing, so they want some visual synergy with that going forward. On the flip side, maybe you don't need to change the faces as much for someone like Black Cat because she's in like 5 cutscenes. But the main character of the whole franchise, whose face you see during all the most important cutscenes, may need to match the performance technology better. You can't spend unnecessary time fixing his data to match the digital head whenever they go out of sync if there's a simpler option to just reduce the extra work. If you have an option to cut out potentially hundreds of additional unnecessary man-hours of work, you're gonna take it. It's why they recast Kratos with someone substantially taller than his original voice actor. It'd be a waste of time and money to keep making this 5'9" guy try to fit a nearly 7-foot tall character for every scene in the game, when you could just get a guy who's over 6'3" to do it and shave off the extra workload. Video games is a business, and they don't get made if they aren't made efficiently, as cold as that may sound. Or maybe both theories are true. Or neither of them, I don't know. I only have an incredibly basic understanding of how this technology and process works.
The dots here make the fake dots do the stuff the same.
I'm not a game developer, I don't work at Insomniac, so I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I'm not gonna make up a bunch of fake bullshit and assert it as fact, and everyone trying to do that is being a dork. It'll take some time to get used to it. I understand that. And if there's really no other way, then fine, I'll give him a chance. Okay, can I get back to talking about Miles in this Miles game?
Hey, true believers, is this the end of Brown Spider-Man? Tune in next week to find out.
Miles himself seems just about perfect. I definitely like him more in this than I did the previous game. It feels like they tried to give him unique traits from Peter without trying to feel derivative of Spider-Verse. So the whole he's also a musician on the side thing was a neat idea and added some charm to him. I appreciate that he feels clumsy and new at the job, but isn't just outright incompetent and can still be badass when he needs to. I was never frustrated with his lack of experience, because wherever he struggled felt understandable and justified, and it was nice to see him learning and polishing his act, so to speak. The title character holds it all together, but I still wish he had a better plot to journey through. From the big things to the little things, I'd say the game gets a lot right about its gameplay, but all of that has to be tied together with a story, and on that front, I felt like that was unfortunately the weakest part of the game for me. The story of Miles goes that a year after gaining his powers, Milhouse Morlock is now finally ready to take a more direct role as the city's secondary Spider-Man. Peter has taught him all the basics and has to take a trip overseas for a few weeks for work, leaving the city in Miles' electrically crackling, hopefully capable hands. But a new gang of young street thugs with futuristic technology called the Underground start causing chaos to send a message to the big corporation that's based itself in New York, Roxxon. Along the way, Miles realizes that his childhood best friend, Finn Mason, is more or less the head of this street gang and uses her gifted mind to build their weapons for a revenge plot against Roxxon after their experimental technology killed her older brother. Miller Lite begs and pleads for her to attack Roxxon by the book after discovering how corrupt they are, but she's too consumed with her lust for vengeance. Also, his uncle is there, and he's a burglar with a cool purple suit, and he didn't really need to be there, but I'm glad he was. Miles has to deal with his first citywide crisis without Peter's help, and figure out how to defeat both his former friend and the evil corporate entity that will poison his hometown. I'm noticing a concerning pattern with Insomniac's villains. They seem to be doing that thing from Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man in the Raimi movies, where every major antagonist has a personal connection in history with Spidey before becoming the main bad guy. Now you don't have to write them an origin story and have Spidey build a relationship with them after they meet for the first time. He's just coincidentally known them for years. Obviously, the majority of the Sinister Six are exceptions to this, but with Martin Lee, Doc Ock, and now the Tinkerer, it looks like all the main villains will follow this formula. And honestly, I feel like that's going to get old really fast. I get it, it's a cheap and easy way to tug at the old heartstrings when the main opposing force is an old friend that lost their way, but it's going to get repetitive if they do that a third time in a row. I have this sinking feeling that, once again, for Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Peter's old bestie Harry Osborn will be Venom and we'll get the whole "but the main bad guy's my bro, I'm so conflicted" scenario, which we just saw twice. Try something else, please. Not every villain needs a deep personal connection to the hero. They can just be a bad guy who mirrors our hero by having an opposing ideology and an interesting backstory or motivation. Thanos wasn't Tony Stark's roommate from college who became jealous of his success. Wilson Fisk isn't Matt Murdock's childhood best friend that went down a dark path. Keep in mind, a bit of this is also coming from the fact that I'm a huge Eddie Brock fan, and I don't want them to forget about him because I want to see how they'd handle that character. But at this point, I'm just waiting for the moment in a future game where Peter is a boss fight for Miles. either because he's wearing the black suit or because he's got Ock Brain. Oh no, my former mentor and best bud, oh no! Meanwhile, Genki becomes the new Hobgoblin and frames Ned Leeds as revenge for confusing casual fans. I also just didn't really like the idea of the antagonists mostly being the same age as Miles. Somehow that undermines the feeling of being an underdog when the underground are teenagers in over their heads too.
What am I doing with my life? I should be studying, flirting with cheerleaders, and playing WoW. Instead, I'm about to get killed in a robot factory.
Breaking into a lab full of armed guards. Christmas break sure is different this year. I should be at home, taking naps, playing a ton of video games, and eating like 100 Christmas cookies.
The corporate stooge behind Roxxon, Simon Krieger, is so generic and lame and boring, and we've seen it a million times. Also, if he had a mustache, he'd look like Lieutenant Dangle. The rich guy wants to make money no matter who gets hurt. People are dead, Burke! Even in other Spider-Man games, we've had this exact archetype. Walker Sloan, Alistair Smythe, Norman Osborn in the last game. But Krieger is so devoid of any depth and so cartoonishly evil, and strangely, he ends up doing very little in the actual plot of the game, only really serving as a plot device for Finn to turn evil and want something to blow up. He has nothing to his character beyond that function. Norman Osborn at least wanted to save his son, but Krieger just wants to make fat stacks and act so scummy you almost wanna just let Finn rip him a new one with a glowing nanomachine sword. The story's main villain, the Tinkerer, reminds me of a glaring issue with Miles as a superhero character. He has no interesting villains. Everyone he fought in the comics was either inherited from Peter or an alternate universe take on another character. Like Scorpion! Even though the Ultimate Universe already had a Scorpion. Bendis never really got around to giving Miles his own rogues gallery, and this game couldn't give him a compelling antagonist without having to make one from scratch. This character is the Tinkerer in name only, but that doesn't mean it's a bad character. Oh no, they changed that super memorable and interesting classic villain. Old scientist man who invents things for crime. Peter doesn't have enough of those to deal with. This game is, however, infinitely funnier if you just replace her in your mind with the Tinkerer from Web of Shadows. Really? Like, can someone mod that for me? And what makes that even more noticeable is that this has way more in common with Spider-Verse than any of Miles' comics. Right down to the fact that it takes place in winter.
Our family doesn't run from things, Miles.
Our family doesn't give up.
Pete's a good teacher, man.
They went the route of making Prowler a conflicted anti-hero that loves Miles instead of the manipulative bastard that died like 13 issues in. Even the newer comics decided to do that too. It's funny to me how every adaptation of Miles makes such a huge deal about differentiating him from Peter and making him unique. Because those initial books have failed so miserably at doing that. The new run is getting better though, props to everyone working on that one, good work so far. But please give him some original villains. All this game had was Rhino as 2 boss fights, and we fought him 100 times before. You know whose life just turned to absolute garbage in 2011? Hobie Brown Prowler fans. They are just starving. He's never going to be in anything now. But back to talking about the story. I feel like it has strong ups and downs. For one, it started to become distracting to me how the plot feels like a rehash of the main game. Spider-Man has to take down a former friend and fellow scientist who has used their intelligence to become a supervillain to exact revenge on a corrupt businessman. The war between our vengeance-seeking villain and the corporate bad guy heats up as their armed forces begin battling each other in the street. The Big MacGuffin is a fictional sci-fi object created by the company that makes people sick, and the villains intend to use it to punish the corporate stooge for being callous with other people's lives, which we find out about through a flashback shown in a video archive after infiltrating the bad guy's lair. The corporate villain's hired mercenary has a change of heart at the end and lets Spidey pass into the final boss after being convinced they don't need to be enemies. The story ends with a big climactic battle on the company's evil tower, where the hero sacrifices their own well-being to save the city, and in turn someone close to them makes a personal sacrifice too that will make them sad in the sequel. The broad strokes are all the same, and it was a bit disappointing to me because I just felt like I had played all of this before, but slightly better 2 years ago. That's not to say that the story isn't executed well in Miles, but it's a story I've already seen, and it was so much more predictable because of that, and harder to gravitate to emotionally. I just never really felt attached to Miles' friendship with Finn, because it was told to us, not shown. The story insists that they are best friends through its collectibles and flashbacks, but By the time the story has begun, she's already had her fall from grace and is already squarely the villain at the start of the story. With Otto, we see him as just a normal, nice guy for way longer. We spend some time with him and Peter together to see this father and son style bond they have. We see Norman Osborn slowly breaking down Otto piece by piece as the story progresses, pushing him further over the edge until he snaps and lashes out. It just felt more interesting to see his fall from grace in real time than to have it be told to me through flashbacks or exposition. I didn't really feel anything for Tinkerer, because she had already made her choice to be the bad guy long before anything could be done about it. And any time we saw her friendship with Miles, it was already painted negatively by future context, rather than allowing the player to just live in the moment.
Step off! Step off!
I think this flashback scene to Miles and Finn's science project being entered at the fair would have been so much more effective if it were placed at the beginning of the game. Then seeing Peter and Otto there would have been like foreshadowing to what would happen next instead of just creating an obvious parallel. And it would have been kind of interesting to see Miles go through that location a second time as Spider-Man, so you're kind of like, as the player, reliving his memory of going through there, because you're like, oh, I was here like 8 hours ago, back before things turned sad. Dropping it near the end of the game felt like backpedaling to try to assure you that these two were friends when we've already seen that kind of fall apart. Now this scene isn't really heartwarming, it's just kind of hollow and tedious. It's a happy memory for Miles, but not for us because we're only experiencing it after seeing everything go wrong. And it felt like it hurt the momentum of the third act to just slow down this hard in the middle of all that action. I didn't feel much for Finn's revenge or her sacrifice at the end, but something else caught me that saved the whole thing. The way the people of Harlem stood in solidarity with Miles to protect his identity. It was all characters who we got to know through the game's side missions, people who I had made my own connections with as they helped me, or I helped them in these various smaller side adventures. It was like the train moment from Spider-Man 2, but even more powerful because I knew who these people were, and I knew why they cared about Spider-Man so much on an individual level. The big, explosive action story and tale of revenge and chaos didn't really do it for me, but everything between was so perfect that it made up for it. Everything about this game that portrays Miles as the hero of his own community is great. The entire cast of characters from Harlem are all lovable and unique, and seeing Miles interact with them and be accepted by them is really touching. Peter is a hero for New Yorkers, sure, but he keeps them at arm's length to protect them, so very few of them know anything about him. With Miles, he still values his secret identity, but a few of his neighbors know it's him under the mask, and protect that information with their lives because they care so much about him. He's one of them, and he has this symbiotic relationship with Harlem where the people in it push him to be better, and he does the same for them. Peter and Miles both spend a lot of time in these games down on the street, helping people in a very personal way. They're not above finding lost pets, fixing broken plumbing, and feeding the homeless. That's what makes them both so human compared to other heroes. Remembering that no good deed is too small. Peter keeps mostly to himself, content with a generally thankless job, but Miles allows himself to love and be loved by these people he helps. Miles has a talent for connecting with people that Peter never really had. They both do the right thing, but they do it a little differently. And that's what makes Spider-Man so special, but also what makes Miles special as Spider-Man. Keep going, kid.